This is Tech Pathways Unlocked, the podcast that delves deep into the journeys of some of the industry's top leaders. We speak with innovators, pioneers and visionaries to uncover the stories behind their success, the challenges they've overcome and the passions that drive them on. Whether you're an aspiring tech leader or a seasoned professional, our goal is to inspire and empower you with insights and advice from those who have navigated the complex landscape of technology to reach the very top. This podcast is proudly brought to you by Stopford Recruitment, where your growth is our commitment. Tune in and let's unlock your pathway to success. Today, I am delighted to be joined by John Martin, the Chief Product Officer at Flagstone. John, welcome to the podcast. It's really great to have you on.
Not at all. Thanks very much for having me, Ollie.
So let's start off this podcast by a little intro to yourself, if possible.
Sure. My background is probably one that is not typical of a chief product officer. In that I spent around 11 years in the army. I was an officer in the Parachute Regiment. And kind of during that period, it was quite a busy time, which was very fortunate in terms of the amount of things that I managed to do during that period. And then subsequently kind of felt that it was a suitable time to move on to what is essentially a second career, I guess, even though I feel too young to be making a statement like that. And so as I came towards the end of my time in the military, I was fortunate enough that a role in technology that was within the defense sector came across my path, and it just happened to be very closely aligned to what I was doing in the military. And so I had quite a soft landing in terms of getting into the technology space, which was very fortunate. But it then allowed me a kind of bridge between the two worlds, if you like. So operated in that kind of area for about a year or so when I just got out of the army, and it also allowed me to have a bit of time to look around and see what was out there. And one of the reasons that I wanted to move away from the military was to try and get a little bit of stability, and that particular role involved a lot of travel, so it was not going to be a long-term solution for me. So I kind of transitioned from that point into some financial services and technology work within London. So that's kind of where I wanted to be based. And so did a few roles around there. I learned quite a lot during that period as well, kind of in terms of how those organizations operate, how to embed meaningful change in some of those organizations. And then the Flagstone role became available after I'd done a couple of jobs in London, and it just looked really, really interesting. So at that stage was quite a small startup. I think we were around 20 people at that point. And now we're well over 10 times that size in terms of the number of clients we have, the assets we have under administration, and the number of people that we have. So it's been quite a rapid growth journey. I've been there about 6.5 years. And yeah, just been a really exciting space to work in. And probably what's the most interesting thing about it is that we have even more exciting things ahead. So it just kind of continues on that trajectory and kind of keeps being really, really engaging and interesting. So that's how I've landed up where I am now, I suppose.
Brilliant. Thanks for that short intro. I suppose it's really interesting because when we've been speaking to the build up to this, learning about your background and sort of the skills that you would have developed being in the military, preparing you for sort of commercial life, if you will, professional work. If you can just sort of just take us back to the start, walk us through your journey in tech so far, that'd be great. So probably, coming out of the military, getting into your first position, what inspired you to pursue that path?
I think it was actually just that it was far more interesting than I would have thought it would be. Okay. So I suppose, particularly when you come out of, I guess, any industry that you've been in for a long time, and certainly true of the military, is that getting your first role feels like a huge hurdle to overcome. You're probably more interested in getting something than you are about getting the thing that might necessarily be right for you. So I think I was surprised at kind of how interesting the technology space is, and probably how engaging it is, and how there is quite a lot of crossover in terms of the skill set that's required to operate in that area.
So just delve into that. Sorry, going back to that point,
Sure.
the skill set that you've presumably gained being within an environment such as the military to then prepare yourself for the tech scene, or
yeah, I think it does prepare you quite well in that, particularly being able to look back at that now in retrospect, is essentially you're dealing with a lot of the same things in that it's a set of complex problems that you're trying to overcome with a team in a short space of time with limited resources and limited people. So essentially, it's the same thing that you've done on a day-to-day basis and have built up a lot of muscle memory around, but you're doing it in quite a different context. And actually, one of the main things I carried forward from the military into that world is that if you want to be successful, that you have to operate as a team in order to do that. So, and that is very, very true in the technology space, where you have a lot of subject matter experts coming together, sharing opinions, sharing thoughts. That collective outcome is always going to be better than something that someone is trying to pursue on their own without any input from those experts. And trying to make the team greater than the sum of its parts is, I think, one of the things that you would definitely take forward from particularly a kind of leadership role in the military. That is something that you really have to harness.
Interesting. And that is really interesting, because I think there's controversial sort of points that can be discussed aside from that, but I like the fact that you've identified that within the military, obviously, to get a sort of problem or challenge completed, you have to get there together. If everyone's in there, then you've got every chance of being successful. Moving into the tech space and into the product world specifically now, where you are achieving that sense of togetherness is obviously is great. In terms of sort of like work drive, motivations, and your work ethic that you've had since the very start, really, is there anything that the military has provided you with that sense?
I think there definitely is, yeah, in that there is a need to be organised with your own time and quite deliberate about the things that you focus on. Because, back to the point about you're always trying to do some complex things in a short space of time, you will never achieve that if you're not personally organised. So you have to maintain quite a high degree of discipline in order to do that. It's quite easy to get distracted when there's so much going on, in particular, that you need to be quite deliberate and objective about the things that you're spending time on and what's important. And a way that is useful in doing that is creating quite clear objectives and goals for yourselves. So, that there's huge popularity of using OKRs or a format of those. We do the same thing, whether that's personal OKRs to help with your own drive, your own focus, and your own organization, but also collective ones as well. Back to the point about the teamwork being so crucial to success, if you want to kind of foster some kind of acceptance of what those goals are and what the outcomes are that you're trying to achieve, then it has to be entirely clear to people what those are, how they contribute to it, and also how they measure it so that they can course correct when something is not going quite right. It's very easy to say I have an abstract objective and I will get to it at some point, but it must be time bound and you must be able to measure it from this point in time to when you achieve it, or alternatively when you don't achieve it, and then make sure that you learn next time round, what am I going to do differently in order to make sure that I do achieve it. So I think it's largely about making sure that you're disciplined about creating clarity for yourself and others at a very early stage.
Yeah, interesting. I've got a friend and an old colleague that was in the army. I think I mentioned this to you during our conversations prior to this. But yeah, he's probably not the and he won't mind me saying this. I might not tag him in this, but he's probably not the organised people from a sort of like, right, where do we go? But sort of like mind and memory, it's all in there. So he's very focused and sort of organised within himself. And he's one of the best recruiters I've met and know. So I can see, and that's why I was wanting to focus on it, the sort of background that you've come through, and obviously you're now where you are today. I knew for a fact that it would have prepared you for sort of professional world, if you like, which is fantastic, and keen to sort of speak more about your career today, moving forward. So, as a leader today, Chief Product Officer at Flagstone, growing business already, a decent sized business from a sort of employee perspective, continuing to grow. What would you say are some core principles or philosophies that guide you as a leader?
I think it's a couple of things that come to mind are, one is fostering collaboration. And I think that's so important. So I probably sound like a broken record when it comes to me feeling strongly about teamwork, but that's because I think the outcomes speak for themselves. As in, when you get teamwork right, you can achieve a huge amount. And I think the culture that breeds, if you're in a more collaborative culture, then it's more welcoming, it's more engaging for people. They feel invested in the outcomes, and they are invested in the outcomes because they can visibly see how they're contributing it towards it. So I think in our context, what that means in technology largely is that you have to create some kind of framework that allows cross-functional collaboration, because it's very easy to create silos. Particularly, again, when you are dealing with subject matter experts, they will naturally be quite deep into their field. And often you need to create a structure whereby they can raise their gaze slightly, they can learn from other people, and they can also apply their own learning into slightly different context. So I think kind of the two things that stand out more than anything else are collaboration and teamwork, plus the culture that supports it as well. And those two things, I think, are kind of synergistic, essentially, as in the more that you create an environment for collaboration and a framework for collaboration, the better your culture will likely be, and they feed each other.
Mm-hmm. So that obviously kind of flows well into our next point, which is obviously the environments. And, you are, educating that sense of collaboration, and you're embedding that within your teams. Is there certain processes that you follow to get your team to that point? Because no doubt, if you inherit a team, for example, or you grow a team from scratch, I presume, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a lot easier to grow a team from scratch, to embed that sort of philosophy, than it is to inherit a team, especially in maybe an underperforming environment. But how is there certain processes that you follow, sort of breaking that down, how you get a team to be, highly collaborative and also successful?
Yeah, I would say the first thing there is to accept that will take time. And the other thing is to accept that you will never fully be done with it, because it always has to iterate. And I think that is probably a lesson that we have learned particularly over the last couple of years when it comes to the structures that we put in place, is that you need to maintain them, and there is an overhead to doing that, because the situation will change, ways of working will need to change, even the focus of certain teams will need to change, and you've always got to be hungry to make it better. And continuous improvement is probably the most important thing that you can focus on. So being better in the next sprint than you were on the last one every single time is, I think, the only way to actually finally get close to the level of high performance that you want to achieve. In order to kind of make that happen from scratch, I think it's important to define what it is you want the team to achieve in the first instance, or the problem that you want them to solve, but allow the team the ownership of how they solve that problem. So being focused more on what the outcome is rather than the output that might achieve that outcome. And that is, I'd say, not an easy task, and it takes quite a long time. And I certainly feel like in our organization, our strength there is not being perfect at doing that. It's focusing on trying to get better at doing that. And we will have to keep doing that, keep iterating, and keep trying to improve.
And as the team evolves, obviously, as you mentioned at the start, you've been there in the early stages of the business, and now obviously as the business starts to grow and potentially go through an exciting period of time as well, like making sure that the team, and you obviously touched on it briefly then, but making sure that the team continue your sort of standpoints on collaboration and getting there as a team, as opposed to rolling the sleeves up, sort of going alone and making sure they just get it done. Because obviously, as a company grows, processes change, more processes come in. It's all hands on deck, isn't it? In the early stages of a business, it continues to do so, but there's a lot more process added in the latter stages as of a company growing. How do you ensure that no one goes off on tangents and are always aligned with the philosophy that you set?
I think you need to keep reiterating that point, and you need to try to do it from the top down and the bottom up as much as possible. So kind of the approach in an early startup phase has a shelf life, as in everyone is probably too stretched and trying to do too much. But that can't continue, because as you kind of build out and grow, the complexity will increase exponentially, and it's not sustainable to try and do that. It wouldn't work. So to try and get into a world where you are operating, I suppose, in an aligned autonomy space, that everyone knows what it is they're trying to achieve, but they have the freedom of movement to achieve it in the way they see fit. I don't think you can exist in that space 100% of the time. It's a very good aspiration to have, and again, to make it close to being a reality, you need to keep reiterating that. And part of that is giving people the freedom and license to fail. So just because a test that you run, for example, is unsuccessful, you still learn something from it. So it's important to allow people the opportunity to do that and then iterate and get better at it. But also, I think you need to accept that you may not exist 100% of the time in that aligned autonomy space, because there are still going to be times where, let's say, for example, there's a regulatory deadline for something quite specific that you have to do in a very specific time frame. Then that's not an area where you have a whole lot of freedom of movement of how you go about executing on it. And so everyone needs to try and be mature enough to accept that there will be times that happens, but then you, as much as possible, need to try and get yourself back onto the track where we're just focusing on, this is the problem we want you to solve, please solve it. This is the metric we want you to move, please move it.
Allowing that room for failure is interesting, and I like that. I think that shows as a leader that it's not going to be perfect first or second time always, and allowing that sort of wiggle room to fail and learn from that, I think is a great little piece of insight, really, which moves me back to the start of your tech career. If you could give one piece of advice to a younger John, what would it be?
I think it would probably be to appreciate more actually how many similarities there are between the world I was working in previously in the military and then in the technology space. And I've spoken to a few other people who've changed industries as well in a different context, and they all say similar things, that I think you have a fear of the unknown when you're moving into something new, and probably don't think about the strong foundations that you might have in a different industry. The skill sets might be very, very similar, and in this instance, they are. Obviously, I know that now in retrospect, but I didn't know that at the time. So I think it took me a good few years to fully understand that and fully comprehend actually the different value that I could add because I had a different background. And that also actually has helped me to appreciate when other people have an entirely different perspective to mine, then it's really useful to actually bring those things together and think about how they complement each other rather than it creating friction where people have differences of opinion. It's actually, we should seize those opportunities as something really useful to find out something you might not have thought of yourself. So I think it would be the similarities between the two worlds. If I could have grasped that earlier, I think I could have probably progressed more quickly in the kind of early stages of that transition.
Mm-hmm. So this is something that we haven't sort of like discussed before this call, but I just pulled it up there in terms of different backgrounds coming into where you are now. Is that you saying as a leader you aren't necessarily too struck up on where they've come from, as in like environment and background, providing they might have the right mindset, attitude, work rate, get up and go, that would make them potentially more considerable than, I say, for example, you have to have come from this background?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you're hiring for a specialist role, obviously, then skill sets in that role are important. Not everyone could become a senior software developer overnight, clearly. But I would say the main thing, main thing that sticks with me in a hiring process is strong culture fit over and above everything else. Certainly more important than skill set in my view, because that's the thing that will stop you being effective, and it will stop you adding to the team as a whole. So I would put that over and above all else.
So you could be the best software engineer in the world, but if the culture, the personality fit isn't there, it's not worth risking.
Definitely not. And actually, something that our people team are very strong on is making sure that everyone is aligned on that. And I think it's been hugely beneficial for us so far, and we will definitely carry that going forward. So, for example, we do a separate interview just on culture that is nothing to do with technical skill set or capabilities, to make sure that someone from outside the hiring team has a view of that person purely from a culture fit point of view, and that really helps us.
Great. That's really good to hear from a sort of, from the outside, neutral to Flagstone altogether. Someone that might be interested in joining Flagstone in the future would hear that, and someone that might not be the best engineer in the world but has potential to be a really good engineer or a really good product designer or product manager, if they've got the right personality, the interest, the drive to get into a business as such Flagstone and the industry operates, then they stand a better chance as opposed to maybe someone that's really experienced who might not be the best personality fit.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Good stuff. Brilliant. So leaders, this podcast is aimed at leaders that maybe are in the individual contributor seat at the moment and want to really, test themselves and jump into the world of management, or those that are starting out in technology and want a bit of sort of like guidance on how to get to the very top, the journey that you've been on and many others that we would get on the podcast, or just leaders like yourself that might want to keep learning and improving. What advice would you give to those individuals, and maybe those that are just starting out in tech, or aspiring leaders that maybe in sort of like individual contributor seats at the moment? What advice would you give?
I think two things probably. One is always being hungry to learn, particularly within technology now. That just seems the rate of change just continues to gather pace all the time. And if you're not learning, then you're inevitably falling behind. And I think that logic applies not just to, say, technology trends, for example, but how you go about interacting with your teams, how you manage, how you coach people. One of the real benefits, I suppose, of this age is information on tap. So I think it's crucial that you create that space and time for yourself to actually learn, get better at what you do, and learn from other people with entirely different perspectives. And then the next thing would be something that I certainly carried forward from the military, was when you're dealing with or working with very deep subject matter experts, is accepting that your role is not to know their role better than they do. So I think one particular job that I did in the military, I was working with people who'd been in that area for 20 years, possibly, and I was going to be there for a maximum of 2. So they will have forgotten more about that than I would ever learn. So it's not my job to try and understand what they're doing better than they do. It was more to give them a different perspective and perhaps raise their gaze to kind of the more strategic context around it. So I think that is something that's important to think about in technology, where there are, by design, some real experts, but you can help them. You don't need to know what they're doing better than they do. You just need to give them a different perspective. And frequently that different perspective is thinking about the strategic context of what it is that they're doing, why they're doing it, and why it adds value to the wider organization, and even who they might want to collaborate with while they're doing it. Because if you're so deep into the details of something, it's not possible always to think about all of those things at once. So I think adding that context is an important role of a leader there.
Nice. And I must reiterate, this isn't a sponsored podcast by Flagstone, but how would your team portray you as a leader? What would you like to think that they would say about you?
Great question. Obviously, I would like to think that they would recognise the things that I've said here. That I value collaboration and I value people's thoughts and input, regardless of where they sit in the organisation. So I always try to be very non-hierarchical in the way that I approach challenges and how we think about the various problems that we're trying to do. So I hope that's something that they would recognize in what I've said today, and just kind of generally how I conduct myself, and also the value that I place on culture in the organization, and it being absolutely crucial to our success within the organization and people joining it, that they need to be a strong culture fit in order to do that.
Perfect. So I'm going to go and do a survey with your team, and if we get the most responses that are correct, you take them out for a meal.
Excellent. Great. Let me get to them first.
Love it. Finally, John, this has been a great episode, so I really appreciate your time. I'd love to hear, through your journey to date, do you have a favourite quote or mantra that just really keeps you motivated?
I do, yes. I'm afraid it's a bit of a cliched one, in that the motto of the Parachute Regiment is ready for anything. So I think about that quite frequently. And probably the most relevant part of it that sticks with me is kind of your definition of readiness, as in not reacting to something, being ready when it happens.
Perfect. John Martin, ready for anything. There's a ring to that, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I like I say, I can't claim that I came up with that myself. It's pretty well embedded.
I just can't wait to hear what your team say.
Neither can I.
Fantastic. John, really appreciate your contributions here. I've really enjoyed speaking with you. And yeah, thanks very much for your time.
Not at all. Thanks very much for having me. Really interesting.
Hey, Ollie here. Thanks for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to get involved in an upcoming podcast, just simply get in touch. And please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share within your networks.